The following story can give you an idea of what it was like to work in an anthracite coal mine in Wilkes-Barre, Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, from roughly the 1930s to about 1960. You may be asking, why does this matter? Who cares? Well, you know what? This is a key aspect to the overall American experience. Our national history, that is, and more importantly, our regional and local history. Unfortunately, most of our area's historical era anthracite coal miners are all gone. Sadly, vanishing with them are their stories. We often take time for granted. I wish that I could go back in time and interview Leonard in greater detail. However, I at least have this story for you today. Leonard Sulzinski was a laborer, miner, and former assistant foreman for the Dorrance Colliery, Lehigh Valley Coal Company in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Leonard gave me an interview in September of 2008, which can offer some insight into the northern anthracite coal field during the World War II era. Leonard Sulzinski was born in 1920. He is a Roman Catholic and he graduated from Coughlin High School, which is located in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, back in 1938. Immediately after graduating from school, he went to work in the coal mines. Jobs were limited around here, and mining was the main employment machine. You were supposed to be 21 years of age, but they took you for your word, he noted. Times were tough and he needed a job. He went to work for the Lehigh Valley Coal Company at the Dorrance Colliery. Don't forget that during 1938, the Great Depression was still occurring. The Great Depression wreaked havoc on many individual lives throughout the United States and elsewhere, but here in the anthracite region, it was felt even harder. During this unfortunate period in American history, a lot of anthracite coal mines were simply idled and or abandoned. If you were lucky to be a coal miner during this time period, it was not uncommon for layoffs to be prevalent. Illegal bootlegging operations flourished during this time period. Something like 10% of all anthracite coal that was produced during this era was illegally bootlegged. Bootlegging being that these men had a skill, they were unemployed, and they simply went and took the coal for themselves. They were illegally mining in old abandoned workings or coal outcrops. Luckily, Leonard didn't have to bootleg. He was able to find a job when a laborer had died. Now this would be a warning to anyone today, and the mine would most likely be closed down pending an investigation, but after all, this was 1938. A laborer was someone who worked for a coal miner. He was paid lower wages and did backbreaking work such as loading the coal car. Leonard had to load 5 coal cars at 5 tons weight each for $6.34 total. I remember other miners telling me that if you had a good coal miner, he would help you load the coal, but often the coal miner, after firing his shots, would go home, leaving his laborer to load the coal himself. The work was tedious and dirty. The miner drilled holes at the face of anthracite to blast the coal from the rock. 7 to 8 shots of explosives were used per blast. The miner had to tamp his shot, which entails packing the rear portion of the blasting hole in order to ensure that the explosive force would properly blast the coal down. Leonard told me that the coal companies did not supply the tamping shot bags. After ensuring that the blast zone was clear, the miners set their charges off at only 60 feet away.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
They were required to allow the smoke to vent out of the site of the blast zone before they picked up the coal and fired another series of shots. They did not do this when he was a laborer, however. He told me of the horrendous hot white smoke that he had to breathe in when returning to the blast site. Miners did this so they could simply go home early. It really messed their respiratory systems up in the process. The Lehigh Valley Coal Company required that the laborer and miner had to top off their mine car. That is, they had to fill the whole 5-ton coal car and add 14 inches to it. The company argued that the coal settled when being transported to the breaker for processing. Leonard argued that this sometimes happened, but not 14 inches worth of settling. If they failed to top their coal cars off, they would be penalized and not allowed to return to work for 2 days. When the coal arrived at the colliery, it was tipped and weighed. Out of 5 tons of coal per car, they were allowed 500 pounds of rock. Any 100 pounds past that, you lost 1 day of work. The coal companies did this until their closing in the late 1950s and early 1960s. For the coal miners, this was just one example of the greed by the coal owners throughout the 100 plus years of anthracite mining's life. For the owners and operators of these mines, however, this was just strict protocol. One can easily see, however, that the topping process was a way for the coal operators to get free labor. For Leonard's 5 days working in the mines, he received $15. He had to wait 2 to 3 weeks for his paycheck. That is a measly $3 per day. He was not yet in the union, but still paid dues. He also was taxed 5 cents per day for his lantern, which did not even work properly. The Lehigh Valley Coal Company showcased the Dorrance as their show model mine for operations. In this aspect, it was good because the mines were more open than the others. During the war, he worked for another miner where he received $25 per every 2 weeks. Leonard said that other laborers raised families with incomes like these. Miners got small bonuses, such as yardage. They were measured for their tunneling distance into the workings. Laborers did not get a cut of this usually, but it depended on the miner's generosity. Leonard had a very sharp mind. He remembered that chicken during this time period was roughly 19 cents per pound, 60 cents per bushel of potatoes, and 20 cents per bushel of tomatoes. This allowed laborers to exist on such wages. This pay was still much lower when compared to the national average, however. Leonard wasn't content with being just a laborer, so he decided to attend Penn State for mining school. He went 3 nights a week for 4 whole years. After work, he attended these college courses, which was no easy task, one might imagine. When the war broke out in 1941 for the United States, the Dorrance Colliery was short manpower. Leonard then filled in as a brakeman on a mine motor. This was an electric mine locomotive. He wasn't sure if he could be able to do the duties. It was dangerous negotiating underground railways in the dark, he told me. The mine section's boss assured him he would be all right though, after just 1 day's training. Mr. Sulzinski mentioned to me that a man was riding on a coal car's bumper when he decided to jump off at his destination. A sharp nail penetrated his foot completely. He also saw men who were pinned, that is, crushed, between timbers and the narrow gauge rail line. When coal cars came around corners, the distance to the sidewall was reduced. If a prop, that is, a timber, was there, it made the space even shorter and deadlier. Seasoned miners learned to watch for small things like this, but complacency always was a danger. My grandfather, who worked at the same colliery, mentioned that a man fell down the vertical haulage shaft after the carriage had departed for the lower depths of the coal mine. That man was lucky, however, because he only fell a couple of feet and landed on top of the cage. Ultimately, he suffered a broken leg. Stories like this number in the hundreds of thousands in the anthracite coal fields. Today's mining safety came about from the recklessness present during the historical anthracite coal mining era. In the old days, when mules were used, they would sometimes murder their human drivers, Mr. Sulzinski explained. The drivers would beat the mules with wooden sprags, small wooden sticks that is, to move them into working positions. Perhaps through premeditation or just animal instinct, they would crush a mule driver against a wall when they used them to push coal cars forward. The animal would have a cold, determined look on its face and would not stop. Animals like this were kept alone for the most part and feared by those who knew about them. Mules in coal mines were a little bit before Leonard's time underground, but not by too much. In 1943, Mr. Sulzinski became an assistant foreman because of his schooling. An assistant foreman would wake up at 1:30 a.m. and leave work for 2 a.m. The fire boss would inspect the workings for gas or other hazardous conditions and mark that spot to prove he inspected that particular area. He would make a report of what was wrong and check on the progress of those issues. Leonard noted that when he was making his rounds underground, he would frequently notice that rats had cancer down there, which raises the question of mining and the health of people in northeastern Pennsylvania today. Perhaps the acid mine drainage and or other harmful elements such as PCB oils in the mines cause this cancer? Who knows? Even worse yet, he said that he would often see the rats eating one another. Oh, but there's more. He told me that when a miner had to take a poop, the rats would smell this and proceed to consume it while they were still pooping. He said that your only defense was a rock in your hand, such as shale or a piece of coal. You had to make a small pile of rocks before you even began to think about pooping, because they were going to show up no matter what. Get this, if a person had a small injury, he would have to wait until 11:30 a.m. to leave with Leonard and the mine foreman via the Vertical Haulage Shaft. You simply were not a priority to the coal company if you had a non-life-threatening injury. They made you wait because they did not want to slow the production of coal down. Miners and anyone involved in the business became a tough breed out of necessity. With Leonard's new job title and responsibilities, he earned a modest $250 a month paycheck. Leonard went on to tell me that all of the easy coal was already mined out, and veins of coal previously deemed unprofitable to mine began to be mined. The Snake Island vein was a 2.5 foot high working. Men had to crawl into these workings and work in there. The only way to get the coal out from those low vein workings was from shaker chutes. No coal cars obviously could be brought to the site of the mining face in a vein of this height. This made the already hard job of being an anthracite coal miner all the more difficult. One day Leonard noticed a hole in the floor of the coal mine. Pillar robbing, that is, pulling the coal supports that were left behind for structural roof integrity, had occurred on the level under his current position. The hole was roughly 3 feet wide by 6 feet long. It reached a depth of about 125 feet, however, and was hollowed out like a teardrop shape. Leonard quickly put some wood planks across it and marked the area off. When he reported what he had found, he thought they would close that section of the mine off. To his horror, the mine foreman simply said it would be alright to go in that particular area. He ordered some rock and cement poured over it and the rail ties to be put back into place. Within a short time, coal cars with men and heavy equipment were being hauled over the hole, not realizing that the floor under them was literally hollow. Again, safety seemed to be an afterthought. Production came first. The Dorrance workings extended under Nesbitt Memorial Hospital in Kingston, a distance of nearly 3 miles. To get to these workings, one had to travel under the mighty Susquehanna River. Leonard told me there was a crack in the ceiling that leaked an alarming amount of water into the workings constantly for years. Just a few miles upstream, the Knox coal mine disaster would later occur. Leonard really enjoyed walking under the Susquehanna River. He said he would often look up at the roof in this particular section of the mine because the geology for him was very interesting. There was an overabundance of fossils up in the ceiling. Sadly, in 1945, Leonard lost his father to the mines. His father was an employee of the Huber Colliery, where he was employed as a miner. Leonard still recalled how his father had to take 2 streetcars to arrive at the Huber breaker. Leonard said that these streetcars were put out of service after the war, unfortunately. His father went down into the mines one day in 1945, and when he was near an electric mine motor, wires caught fire in a bizarre accident. He was overcome by the bright light emitted, and the noxious fumes choked him. In a daze, he fell down a vertical air shaft opening, which claimed his life ultimately. He was only 57 years old. When miners came to report the bad news to his family at their house, they mentioned that a company doctor was on the way over. Everyone was understandably shocked and upset at the news of this unfortunate incident. An hour came and the doctor showed up. His mother asked where her husband's body was. The doctor said he was not releasing the body to the family until an autopsy had been performed. Mrs. Sulzinski protested this and asked why this was being done. She did not want an autopsy. Clearly, he died in a mining accident, so what was the point? The doctor snapped back that he believed that Mr. Sulzinski had died from a heart attack, and that led to him falling down the vertical drop. Leonard's father had signed up for a small life insurance program that the company had sponsored. One can easily see that a potential motive for why this doctor wanted an autopsy performed was that the coal company was simply trying to get out of paying $22 a month for 4 years to the widow. Obviously, the doctor didn't tell the family that, but they had a feeling. When Leonard and his family continued to protest the autopsy, the doctor threatened to get a court order. Now see, if the coal company wanted this, they would have it granted because the coal companies and the courthouse were tight. Leonard was very passionate when he was telling me this. He told me in a quiet voice that he believed that the coal operators and their sidekicks were absolutely ruthless. I remember Leonard telling me that he pulled the doctor off to the side and had some choice words for him. And after that point, the coal operators decided not to have an autopsy performed on the body, and his mother received those payments. So good for him. That's a good son right there. That poor family having to go through that. This wasn't the first time, unfortunately, that a relative of Leonard's had been killed in the coal mines. His grandfather, Ludwig, died in 1908 at just 37 years old at Mount Lookout in Exeter, Pennsylvania. An explosion killed him and 8 other men. His body was simply dumped onto his porch in front of his children. I remember when Leonard was telling me this story about how the children were screaming because they were looking at this disfigured body on their porch. Doing that to the children of that man who lost his life in service of your company. Can you imagine, what was wrong with them back then? Have a little bit of humanity. The family received no compensation and had no funds to bury their father and husband. Their Polish church in Exeter gave a plot of land to the wife for free in the back of the cemetery. Ludwig did not even get a proper casket. It was simple wooden planks nailed together. You might imagine that stories like this would have turned Leonard away from the mines, but it did not. Again, employment opportunities in this region were extremely limited. Back in 2008, Leonard's memory was just remarkable when he was telling me this story because he could remember exact dates, such as on November 30th, 1944, he noticed that the mine foreman was missing when the miners were waiting at his station to get the go-ahead to assume their working positions for their day. Jimmy Gartley was doing his rounds and never came back. It was now 6 a.m. and he had left at 3 a.m. to do his daily rounds. Leonard proceeded to search for him deep underground, and he did eventually find him. When Jimmy was marking a rock with chalk, saying that he inspected this particular area, a cave-in fell on him. Poor Leonard having to witness that and process it. Before Leonard had showed up, Jimmy believed he was going to die after being trapped. He wrote on a piece of board to his family that he loved them. Poor Jimmy was in shock by the time Leonard reached him at approximately 6:30 a.m. Leonard had to get more help to get the rock off of him because it was extremely heavy. The circulation in his legs was non-existent from the great weight of the rock. Jimmy would have been rushed out of the mine, up the vertical haulage shaft. Once outside, he would have been driven essentially just down the street from the coal mine to nearby Wilkes-Barre General Hospital. Leonard went to visit him at the hospital a few days later. Jimmy greeted him and introduced him to his family. Leonard was horrified at how bad Jimmy was looking. Leonard spoke to Jimmy's wife outside of the room. She told him that the prognosis was not good and he would most likely not survive. Jimmy was awake and alert and obviously speaking, but the trauma to his body was just too much. Unfortunately, Mr. Gartley did pass away at Wilkes-Barre General Hospital. and yet another soul was lost in the coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania. Leonard would continue to work underground at the Dorrance Colliery up until the infamous Knox coal mine disaster of January 1959. The Dorrance Colliery was located on the banks of the Susquehanna River, and just a few miles upstream from the Dorrance, coal miners working at the Knox accidentally punched through the riverbed, causing an apocalyptic-like whirlpool of water rushing into their coal mine. 12 miners would ultimately lose their life in that disaster. Deep underground mines were in decline in the Wyoming Valley during that time period. The Knox coal mine disaster gave the coal operators a reason to just walk away from it all. Leonard told me that everything, equipment-wise, was left underground and written as a tax write-off. They simply turned the pumps off and allowed the mine to fill with water. After nearly 100 years of being open, the Dorrance Colliery was abandoned. The coal breaker, which was the processing plant on the surface, would sit abandoned until 1984 when it was finally torn down. I asked Leonard how he felt about it all, his job that is, what he thought about the entire experience. He told me, you know what, I actually really enjoyed it. If I had to guess, I would say that Leonard was rather sentimental. He told me back in 1984 when they were tearing down the Dorrance breaker itself, he had to go over there and retrieve a small piece of the metal from the actual facility. He explained to me that it was somewhere down in his basement. Mr. Sulzinski, after the Dorrance closed, waited for years to be hired by the Department of Health. He retired from there after 28 years working. Jobs were hard to come by for everyone, especially the past coal miners. Many past miners moved out of the area entirely after the mines closed, or commuted far away to new jobs. For Leonard and many like him back in 1959, the era of hard coal was over. Oil and gas were simply more convenient forms of energy, and all the easy coal was gone here in the northern anthracite coal field. 1917 was the peak year of anthracite coal production, at slightly more than 100 million tons produced. There was a gradual decline after 1917 of the tonnage produced. Things such as constant labor strife only further hurt the industry. The coal strike of 1925 through 1926 would become a defining setback for hard coal, costing hundreds of thousands of customers. By the time of the Knox coal mine disaster in 1959, the industry was just a shell of its former self. That mining disaster simply finished off the mining industry here in the northern anthracite coal field a little bit faster than anticipated. We should and we must remember people like Leonard Sulzinski, who lost his family and friends to the mining industry, but kept at his job deep underground. By doing so, he kept people's homes warm, industry powered, the World War II effort going, and more importantly, he provided a home for his family, food in their bellies, and for the prospect that his future generations of family would have it better than he did. Leonard is a testament of the people who labored in the area collieries. They worked unimaginably hard, they suffered, adapted, persevered, and in the end, they managed to survive. Leonard passed away in 2011 at the age of 91. I think of Leonard even to this day. He was just a cool guy. Such a nice man. He worked with my grandfather Joseph Gibbons at the Dorrance, and he would have also known my two great-grandfathers, Michael Marciniak and Andrii Teslicko, who all worked underground at the same coal mine. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for listening. See you later.